Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a couple of questions for proponent of the bill for clarification, sir.
Representative Berger, please prepare yourself. Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, in starting line 16 through 24, we have a definition of capital expenditure. And I look at the items that are included in there. I certainly understand things like site and infrastructure improvements, R&D costs related to development of new products and markets that would increase revenue to the state, and even acquisition of machinery and equipment, and lands and buildings that, while it wouldn't necessarily generate any additional revenue, is an expansion of the capability of the company. The one that puzzles me is actually the final opportunity is the development of diversification strategies. And I wonder if the proponent of the bill could explain to me what that means. What is a diversification strategy, and why are we subsidizing it under capital expenditures? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I believe the good representative is talking to federal definitions that are included in the agreement. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative France.
I thank you for that answer. I guess the real meat of it is to the next, which is a regional diversification strategy. And if we're looking at regional, is that include beyond the borders of Connecticut? So we including capital expenditures that go beyond our state that we are now subsidizing with a potential reimbursement depending on whether they meet the thresholds of the $76 to $93 million over this term of the contract on an annual basis. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if I understand it correctly, through this agreement, any thresholds or grants achieved by the agreement for Sikorsky would be only achievable under the guidelines of this agreement. If there were production produced outside of the state of Connecticut or the location of the headquarters outside of the borders of the state of Connecticut, i.e. Stratford, then any grants or benefits achieved would not be achievable. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative France.
Thank you for that answer. As a follow-up to that question, there was in the press recently that Germany is interested in the same airframe. And I guess the question would be if they were expanding the capability within the state of Connecticut to handle that additional production, would those expenditures for the corporation within the state of Connecticut be included to subsidize production of this airframe for a foreign country? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker. It certainly is, it would be the desire of Sikorsky to be able to increase their workforce beyond some of our targeted numbers. So within the course of the agreement, there has been built in increased benefit for the company to expand beyond the original agreement to be able to achieve benchmarks for employment, for capital expenditure, for supply chain funds, and for payroll. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative France.
Thank you for that answer. I guess the follow-up to that, I understand that the terms of the contract as it currently stands with the Navy is for approximately 200 airframes. That's really the basis for the agreement and a lot of the numbers in both for payroll and employment. I guess my point is we're now looking at a potential that they would get an order of anywhere from 40 to 60 additional airframes for a foreign government. And if they then increase their payroll and employment, would we also be subsidizing that investment beyond the 200 airframes that are as part of the Navy contract for the United States government? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. Again, within the context of the agreement, there are performance criteria for grants worked into the various tranches and 4 buckets of incentive packages, which we previously spoke about. The agreement targets the 253K heavy lift helicopter, and it's certainly employment levels above these targets and or any of the other 4 buckets would be subject to achievable grants above the targeted numbers. Through the course of the 14-year contract, if that were achieved, this agreement would be in place. If after the 14-year agreement, this were to take off in Germany and literally and figuratively, if this were to take off, that we are hopeful that we would need an additional agreement beyond this 14-year agreement to expand into further incentives and/or grants. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative France.
Thank you for that. Final question for the proponent is related to this agreement. Is there an ability to modify the terms of this agreement? I do notice a section here related to changes in particular timing of delivery, et cetera. If there are changes to this agreement, does it need to come back to the legislature for approval? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the agreement stands on its own as far as its language, that if there are any changes or a decrease in the criteria based on grants and incentives, that is a sliding scale. That if you were not achieving certain numbers within that sliding scale, you would not get the benefit of a complete grant or sales and use tax exemption. Under that guideline, it would not need to come back to the legislature. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative France.
Thank you for that answer. And I'll summarize now. As I've listened to the debate, both here and in the Senate chamber, the thing that concerns me the most is when you enter into negotiation, I'll leave the principled argument aside. My colleagues have already argued that position and stated that. But when you enter into negotiation, the first thing that you must know is what's the do-nothing proposition. And it's clear from the numbers that have been thrown around from members of both this chamber and the Senate that there is not an understanding of what the do-nothing proposition is. In other words, if we do not approve this, what is the cost to the state beyond certainly the employees that would likely lose their jobs and maybe move with the company or not? Because I've heard everything from a reduction to becoming a maintenance facility with either 3,300 or 5,000 employees to all 8,000 employees of Sikorsky leaving the state. I've heard everything from all 302 suppliers and 24,000 employees that are of their leaving the state of Connecticut, going out of business. The challenge with all of that is that it's not consistent. And so we don't know what the do-nothing proposition. And why is that important? It's important because we need to understand whether the $220 million is a good deal or it's not. If you don't know what the do-nothing proposition is and the cost of that, then you have nothing to measure the final deal against to know whether it's good or bad. Is the number 220? Should it be 200? Should it be 150? We don't know. The reality is on the supply chain, some number of those employers, those suppliers, have patents. They have proprietary information that Sikorsky has to go to them. They have no option but to go to them. So whether they build in Connecticut, Florida, or some other state, they would have to come back to those suppliers to get that equipment. And so we don't know, and that's a real fundamental problem that I have with this agreement, is that we've negotiated a deal starting from a lack of knowledge of what if we do nothing. So we really don't know how good this deal is or isn't. We make some assumptions, but those assumptions are so broad as to go from the entire company leaves to something in between that we have no real strong basis for understanding this process and how good this deal is or isn't. And for many of the reasons that my colleagues have stated, I don't believe that we should be in the business of trying to figure out and be venture capitalists. We have a challenge here because we've created an environment in this state that is not conducive to businesses large and small. We have seen them leave. We've seen them close and not move. We've seen them move to other states that are more conducive, more business friendly. We see ourselves as a state chronically rated at the bottom of the 50 states in all of these categories, and yet we do nothing. We all admit that it's the problem, but we don't do the hard work to solve the problem, to figure out what we can do to stop having to pay companies or incentivize companies to remain within our state. There are lots of categories where our state is very positive. People talk about wanting to live here. The challenge is the same people that say they do say they can't afford to any longer. That needs to change. We cannot continue to pay for companies to stay here and expect that our state will thrive. So for many of those reasons and others that I've heard in this debate, I will not be supporting this bill, and I appreciate your time, Mr. Speaker.